So next up, we will be exploring where Alzheimer's research is today and how researchers and physicians are working to radically transform the process of detection, diagnosis, and care for patients. For more on that, we welcome on stage Dr. Charbel Moussa, Director of the Laboratory for Dementia and Parkinsonism at Georgetown University, and Dr. Francois Bowler, a neurologist with the GW Medical Faculty Associates. Kim Dixon is back for this interview. Kim, back over to you.
Thank you, Johanna. So thank you, Dr. Bowler and Dr. Moussa, for taking the time to walk us through what's happening at the clinic and what's happening in research. We were talking backstage a bit about the history of Alzheimer's disease and how it's not a modern phenomenon, and it goes back to 1907 when I think you said there was a description of half a page of the condition, but it's definitely evolved since then. Do you want to give us sort of a little historical perspective?
Alzheimer, we're very surprised to know that he has become such a household name. His interest was in vascular disease and in neurosyphilis. He described this occurrence in half a page of a local journal of southern Germany. And Kreppelin, who later on wrote a book in which he thought that there would be 3 types of dementia, the ones that dementia precox, which is schizophrenia, senile dementia, everybody else, and in the middle, a very tiny percentage of people who have pre-senile dementia, Alzheimer's disease. And until 1974, it was continued to be thought as be very uncommon. But then in 1974, a group of people led by someone Bob Katzmann and Catherine Bick here at NIH, thought that Alzheimer's disease pathology did not know any age. You could have it much earlier, you could have it much later. So Alzheimer's disease became well known, in fact, perhaps probably overdiagnosed. And now at this point, we are at the stage in which we realize that true Alzheimer's disease is not quite as common as was thought to be, but still it remains much common, much too common.
In terms of the clinical realities, you're seeing patients. I think we also talked about sort of looking at things as the glass half full versus the glass half empty, and you can look at it from both points of view. Tell us,
but the reason why
tell us what's happening on the good side.
The reason why I said that, can I start with the bad side?
No, you can start whatever side.
From the bad side, the fact is that, first of all, people who have an advanced stage of the disease is going to be very difficult to cure them. We may find ways of improving them, but that's another story. The other difficult aspect of Alzheimer's disease is that animal models are, there's no real animal model that exactly fits the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. These are the negative aspects. The positive aspects are that in 1986, there was a turning point because for the first time, a medication was approved by FDA for use in Alzheimer's disease. It went by the nice name of tetrahydroaminoacridine. Just with a name like that, it was doomed to fail. But it was hepatotoxicity. But still, it was a turning point. But before that, and even to this stage, there are things that can be used in Alzheimer's disease that one must think about. One of them is the fact that by having people understand, both the patient and their family, what the condition is about, what's going to happen, what they can expect, is very helpful. In the Alzheimer's Center that I set up in Pittsburgh, we created group therapy that were enormously helpful to the patient, to their families. The other important aspect is that even before these drugs were introduced, which are not disease-modifying, but still provide some help, there is all the psychiatric and psychological aspects of the disease that can be treated, so-called BPSDs. So that is something very important which we can act in these patients.
So Dr. Moussa, there's no shortage of drug candidates, it seems like. I think I wrote down 150 drug candidates, and there have been some high-profile disappointments. Right. So why are there so many failures, and how would you assess the current state of the research?
Right, so there are 150 candidates that are being tested now, either preclinically or clinically for Alzheimer's disease. As Dr. Bowler just mentioned, there are animal models which are considered an approximation of the pathology, not really, they don't 100% mimic the human condition. So I think this is one of the problems we are facing. The other thing is the failures stem largely, I don't think it's from the preclinical work, it's actually from the clinical, from the way clinical trials are handled. And are handled because they're handled in such a way that because of the difficulty of the disease, as Dr. Bolo just mentioned, Alzheimer's disease is a continuum it progresses over a long time. And the problem is, historically, we've been interfering at a stage where the disease is probably too advanced. So at that point, it's probably difficult to reverse the disease. So the move now in the field is basically, let's go earlier on in the disease, and then let's see if we can interfere early on before we get a lot of degeneration in the brain. The third thing is, it's really our understanding of the disease. It's been 100 years, and I think, or 100 plus, 100 years and 110 years since 1907. And initially, we thought that there was one central hypothesis that's responsible for, that we need to work on to cure Alzheimer's disease, and it's called the amyloid hypothesis. Now we know that the amyloid hypothesis is relevant but incomplete, So now, initially or traditionally, we used to think amyloid plaques, which were defined by Dr. Alzheimer's, were really the defining pathology of Alzheimer's disease. Now we know that 50% of people who have plaques in their brain, they don't have Alzheimer's disease. And 50% of people who have Alzheimer's disease don't even have plaques in their brain. The second thing is we've learned since the 70s until today of another gene or another protein called tau, which forms what we call tangles in the brain. And it's really the co-occurrence of tau and tangles together, along with neurodegeneration, that seem to be the most consistent with the onset and development of Alzheimer's disease. So now that we know this, if you like, constellation of pathologies, we probably are at a much better, if you like, vantage point, dealing with a potential cure for the disease.
There's a third component also, white matter lesions.
Absolutely, yeah, which is pretty.
Well, we're sitting here in D.C. From a policy point of view. Someone on the last panel said, what's being done right, what's being done wrong. One person mentioned the hiring freeze. Is that impacting your interaction with NIH in terms of research, or can you address sort of what the federal government can do to help the research?
Well, perhaps again, it's worth a word of history. I heard before that in 1981 there was almost no mention of Alzheimer's disease. When the National Institute on Aging was created around that time, it was thought to be just for normal aging. But someone then decided that they should put the emphasis also on pathological aging, like Alzheimer's disease. That's how the Alzheimer's disease research centers were created. And they remained a major way of advancing the condition, and hopefully this will continue.
Right. So I really think there is some effort, although incomplete, on the side of the federal government, and there has been an increase in funding for Alzheimer's disease. But the point I want to make is this. We haven't heard of any cancer as much as we heard of Alzheimer's disease. And the cost of Alzheimer's disease alone is very close to the cost of all cancers combined. And one of the things that, like, if we take breast cancer, for instance, the reason why we, to a very, very large extent, defeated this cancer is because women in the world, all women in the world, came behind this cause and they said, we have to do something about this. What we need now for Alzheimer's disease, we need everybody in society to come out and say, everybody would have somebody or know somebody affected by the disease. So we need to be a true coalition, at the grassroots level, to lobby government, to go after philanthropy, to strengthen the role of foundations. Foundations have played an enormous role in basically funding Alzheimer's research. So I think it is a multifaceted effort. It's an effort that needs a grassroots societal move.
Do you see that happening? Because obviously, the difference is the patients are likely not going to be the people that are advocating the movement.
No, but the Alzheimer Association has played an enormous, very extremely important role in making people, in gathering funds, but also in making people aware. And one aspect is getting autopsies. Autopsies were almost They were extremely. When I started applying my residency, there was a book in which they were saying how good the program was, how many autopsies they had. Now, they disappeared practically, and the Alzheimer's Association has made people understand how important it is to have a pathological diagnosis, even in this day and age in which, with imaging, we have advanced way of diagnosing the condition.
I think there's a national goal. There was an Alzheimer's Act in 2012 and a goal to get effective prevention and treatment by 2025. I mean, how hopeful are you that we're on the way to that goal?
It depends on what the solution that are.
I think in terms of research, I think there is a lot of hope. There has been failures, and we have to think about how much we knew about the disease. Today we used to rely almost exclusively on postmortem autopsies of the brain to try to understand the disease. Today there are diagnostic imaging. We can do lumbar punctures and get CSF from patients and test what we call biomarkers of the disease. So we have a better understanding, and we have more tools to basically study the disease and study the disease onset, progression, and probably the effects of a treatment or a potential treatment on the disease. Again, I think there is a lot of hope because, again, historically we thought the amyloid hypothesis is the only thing that we needed to do. Lower the level of amyloid, you'll cure Alzheimer's patients. We haven't seen that. We have seen a number of trials where they have successfully lowered the amount of amyloid, but they did not change the cognitive outcomes. So now we know that we have several hypotheses, not just one. We need to interfere with a number of issues. A number of strategies are now in place. With more strategies and more diagnostic tools, I think there is more hope. It's difficult to put a timeline on research because research is really all about empirical evidence, and we need to gather that evidence and before we can claim victory. So timelines are really ingrained in the discovery itself.
One of the interesting stories to be followed, in particular at the Pittsburgh Alzheimer's Center, which I had created, was to follow not just people who are sick, but people who are healthy. What are the biomarkers of health are just as interesting as the biomarkers of disease.
Well, that gets to a point that was made on the last panel, I think, about the difficulty or the challenges in recruiting people for clinical trials, the necessity of having a partner or some caregiver. How have you sort of tackled those challenges, Dr. Moussa?
It's very, very, very challenging. So unlike any other disease, including neurological diseases, an Alzheimer's patient really depends on a caregiver. And the caregiver has to be there, the study partner has to be there to monitor compliance, to make sure that the patient is taking their medication every day. And what we have historically had is because we've been targeting people in the mid to late or mid to moderate stage of Alzheimer's disease, I think at that point there is a significant cognitive impairment in patients, and it's really difficult to get somebody to participate in a clinical trial where it's not only the patient, it's the patient and the caregiver and the study partner both have to participate, and that's very taxing because people have to leave their job, people have to monitor the patient daily, so the caregiver job is tremendously important, both in terms of care for the patient and in terms of clinical trials. We now moving towards earlier stage of the disease where we hope that patients are in the mild cognitive impairment stage, meaning they are still functional in many ways. They may be able to participate on their own in a clinical trial. This has its inherent problems as well because we don't know if all the mild cognitively impaired patients will convert to Alzheimer's disease. That's really a big challenge for us right now. But I think one of the ways in which we can reduce the dependence of an Alzheimer's patient on a caregiver is basically by moving to an earlier stage of the disease when the patient is still not dependent on others.
Because ideally, what we seek is prevention rather than cure.
Right, right. One question I had on, the search for a treatment is, given all the failures, and it's not a nice word to use, but when clinical trials fail, I mean, how worried are you that drug companies are just not going to be interested? You know, they'd rather do something that's an easier target. It's been 100 years, and we're still trying.
Well, there was a rush of drug companies going into it, and then because of the failures that some of them withdrew. However, it remains that whoever discovers something that is really helpful will have such an enormous impact on the world health that hopefully the incentive is still there.
Right. So, you know, in the U.S., there's about 5.5 million patients who have Alzheimer's disease. This number is, considering the age of, the rate of aging in our society, maybe we will have like, 50 million by 2050. And the key thing from a pharmaceutical perspective is a drug that might work for Alzheimer's disease may also work for a lot of other neurodegenerative diseases. So we're not just talking about like treating a single disease, we're treating about a drug that may work for a number of neurodegenerative diseases because they share a common denominator: Parkinson's, Huntington's, Alzheimer's. So whether the reason or the etiology is like genetic or environmental or aging, the common denominator of all these diseases is accumulation of toxic proteins that can basically kill the brain over time. So we think that one treatment that works for one is highly likely to work for other diseases. So from that perspective, I think it's a big money-making thing for pharmaceutical companies. So everything is trial and error, and the most important thing to understand here is we have now a lot of technological advances that can help us track a treatment paradigm real time. We know more about the disease, and we have a number of strategies that we can experiment with to come to a treatment. I think, I'm very optimistic about the future of Alzheimer's research and neurological or neurodegenerative research in general. But I think, it's difficult to put a timeline.
But to some extent, it is already true that the medications that we have now, which are not often effective, but sometimes they work, and they work not just in Alzheimer's disease, but also in vascular conditions and even in post-traumatic patients. So it's already true that the medication we find will go much beyond just Alzheimer's.
It's true.
We have a few minutes for questions. I think there are some people with mics. Does anyone want to pose any questions? Someone in the back?
Yeah, sure. I'll try my crack at it without the mic. But I was wondering, you talked a little bit about prevention of Alzheimer's disease. I wanted to poke a little bit more that, what's the best way to prevent Alzheimer's?
Well, the idea would be to find those lesions that are present in the brain before they manifest themselves clinically and treat those very people. That's being done right now. There was a huge therapeutic trial that aims at treating those patients who are, based on the tests that Dr. Moussa was saying, likely candidates of the disease, treat them at that stage. So whatever medication is going to be, or whatever drug, whatever compound is going to be helpful, to apply it very early, that's the prevention.
Yep, up front.
Hi, my name is Jenny Ho. Really appreciate the insight. I like to add on to the point about prevention. Is from my personal experience. I find the past few years, because of problem with sleeping, my cognitive functioning and executive functioning had declined tremendously. And I start exercise, but the most helpful would be the program documentary by PBS about the brain and brain fitness exercise. It explains how our brain functioning, and it also, I guess, confirm the fact that we can take active action to reverse the decline. It is our experience that help us to keep the brain in shape, just like physical exercise. If we get exposure, new experience, not just crossword puzzle, not just language, but every day we focus on how to challenge our brain. So I use myself as a subject. And over the past couple of years, with rock climbing and pushing myself to read different subjects as if I'm preparing for exams. And now my functioning actually surpassed the peak when I was working I stopped working 20 years ago. And I have never experienced this kind of clarity in my brain. So it shows that we can take action to improve our brain function as we age.
Absolutely. That's one thing that I should have said. In fact, so much so that some recent studies from Germany and even one in the US show a decrease in the incidence of Alzheimer, probably because of higher education. The more educated the brain, the more it doesn't prevent the disease, but it acts in such a way that the disease, after the disease, there are enough reserves that the brain can continue to function even with the disease. So stimulating the brain early and at any stage is extremely helpful. And so is good sleep also very important.
Well, any other questions from the audience? Oh, okay, sure, we'll take one more.
Jason Resendez with Us Against Alzheimer's. One of the things that Daisy talked about earlier was her work to engage Latinos in clinical research. Can you talk a little bit about, from a scientific perspective, the importance of diversity in clinical trials and clinical research?
This is a serious issue. Today when you report report the results of a clinical trial, there's always a question: is there enough distribution of gender in the trial, ethnicity? We run clinical trials here in the DC area, and it's very difficult to get certain groups, certain ethnic groups to participate in a clinical trial. It probably has to do with the lack of awareness, has to do with the stigma, and even within the, the general white population, not everybody participates in a clinical trial. Unfortunately, participation in a clinical trial tends, in my opinion, to be within a certain group of people, maybe more affluent, people who have more access to the medical care and medical system. And quite often, these participants in clinical trials tend to be participate in multiple clinical trials, not at the same time, at different times. What we try to do, we try to have people, key people in the trial operations who are of a certain ethnic groups, certain ethnic backgrounds, who target basically specific communities. People generally tend to be more comfortable with the people of their own, if that's the right term. We target specific religious groups. We target, so we employ nurses who are basically Latino or African Americans to reach out to the Latino community and the African American community. But having said, participation is still very low, and that needs a lot more work. It's not just the job of the clinical trialist, unfortunately, because when you run in a clinical trial and you have 1 year of enrollment or 6 months of enrollment, there's very little you can do. You can campaign, you can advertise, you can do anything. I think stakeholders like organizations such as yours are very critical to increase the number of participants of different ethnic groups. It's still below 10% of participation of, it seems now that there is an even number of men and women in clinical trials, but other than white population is still less than 10%.
In your experience, Dr. Baller, treating patients, have you seen a difference in the types of in populations that you've seen over time in more minorities due to increasing awareness, or?
I want to say something which is indirectly related. In Houston, there is an interesting enclave of people who are Spanish, Hispanophones, and relatively little education. And the idea is for a gentleman, Gustavo Roman, is just starting a study in that community. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. For the moment, there's not too much evidence of ethnic differences. And in terms of gender, who has more Alzheimer? Female, who thinks that it's mainly ladies who have Alzheimer more than males? Raise your hand. Oh. The problem is that if you go to a nursing home, of course there are many more women, but the thing is that we males are weaker, and we are older, we get the dementia, we die. So that's why there is a bias in this sense. Probably at this point it's maybe a slight bias for females.
There is some, I can't call it evidence, but some suggestions that maybe females are much more resilient to the rapid decline that we see in Alzheimer's disease compared to men.
Females are more resilient to everything.
I think we have one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
We all see that in internet and social media, crowdfunding is so big for just basic little products and things like that. Whereas Alzheimer's, what are they doing to try to market for real crowdfunding from the actual people in the world as opposed to just government and things like that? And not only for financing, but for actual people to come out and get tested to where the data can be accumulated.
I can tell you something very important there. I have clinical trials and they're not funded by the government. Most of the clinical trials that I have right now are actually funded by philanthropy, by interested patients. Crowdfunding is enormously important. And look, it's an important basic question, like, where do we want to invest? Do we want to invest in a nursing home, which is very important for people who need it, or do we want to invest in a cure? I think crowdfunding would probably be more directed towards funding a cure than a nursing home. I mean, there is a lot of legislation we just heard this morning and a lot of work and at the federal government level where there is a moral and ethical commitment that, you know, we have to help people who need the help. But before people need the help, there is the altruism of everyone in society to say, well, you know what, this is a disease that may affect me or a member of my family or a friend or somebody I know, and we should do something about it. So crowdfunding is very important.
And a dilemma that what brings you mind, there was a dilemma in the late 40s about polio. What should we do? Should we buy more iron lungs, the machine that made people survive, or should we invest in research? We invest in research to discover the vaccine, and that took care of the disease. Hopefully we'll do the same with Alzheimer.
Hopefully we will do the same. It's a good way to end it. Thank you both for taking the time. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to Kim. That brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of Biogen and The Hill, I'd like to thank you for joining us. If you missed any portion of the program, it will be on thehill.com later today. And as a reminder, fill out those feedback forms. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.